Let's talk about Khrushchev and Stalin's quotes on whether or not the Soviet Union would have lost without Lend-lease. Last time I talked about Zhukov and his supposed quotes. I debunked that they were actually real quotes or that they were taken in context, which is not the case. This time I will talk about these Soviet premiers who are very often used because of their so-called incriminating quotes, which suggest that the USSR would have lost World War II without Lend-lease. Starting off with Khrushchev, who became the Soviet leader in the 1950s, the quote presented by Radio Free Europe, among others, is as follows. If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. One-on-one against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught and would have lost the war. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion, but I can say that he expressed his views several times in conversations with me. This quote in Radio Free Europe is taken from a Russian website that carries a Russian translation of the English published book Khrushchev Remembers, a biography about Khrushchev, allegedly based on audio recordings of Khrushchev that was smuggled to the West and turned into this book published in 1970. Why doesn't Radio Free Europe cite the book in English, the original language? Presumably because doing so would make source verification easier, which is a very unfortunate trend for a journalist. The quote itself obviously states the USSR would have lost. Khrushchev says Stalin never left any written records of the idea without Western aids the USSR would have lost. In fact, Stalin did actually do this, and I will show shortly that this is the case. Already here we can question whether Khrushchev, like Zhukov, is a competent witness, if he actually isn't aware of the things Stalin said while saying he speaks for them. If this quote is taken seriously, he clearly did not know everything Stalin communicated or said, even publicly. However, this quote is almost certainly not something Khrushchev said. Khrushchev's son Sergei Khrushchev published Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs later in 3 volumes. The biography published in the United States in the 1970s is about 600 pages long, whereas the version published with the involvement of his son is 3 volumes totaling more than 3,000 pages. So if they were both based on audio recordings of Khrushchev, then the American one left out about 80% of the content. Additionally, it should be noted that the translator and editor of the American version is none other than Strobe Talbot, a US official and politician. We're asked to overlook that this version of Khrushchev's words were not translated by a professional translation service, but by a journalist who later became a close associate of Bill Clinton and a political figure. In the version published by Sergei, Nikita Khrushchev also talks about Lend-lease, but uses vastly different words. This is the quote from the first volume. When we began to receive American aid through Lend-lease, we received large quantities of trucks, locomotives, rails, food products, and raw materials. All this played an important role in supplying the front and strengthening our economy. Without this help, it would have been much harder to conduct the war. This is quite different from saying the USSR would have lost the war. In fact, it is barely recognizable as being based on the same recordings as the first quote. In this version, Khrushchev is saying Lend-lease was significant and would have made things harder without it, which I don't think is disputed by anyone. It is, however, different than what the quote most people like to use is saying. So why use a quote presented by a US politician during the Cold War rather than the ones his own son presents in a more complete version and is translated officially? Khrushchev also makes a statement on Lend-lease in the 3rd volume, where he mentions spam very briefly. It's not worth going into depth with this. It is in the context of negotiations with JFK over payment for Lend-lease, and this remark is very brief and casual, with Khrushchev simply explaining that he acknowledges that Lend-lease was real. Now, if we move on to Stalin. Stalin's statements on Lend-lease, like those of Zhukov and Khrushchev, is often used in discussions regarding the significance of Western aid. The most often cited and important quote is from the 30th of November 1943 in Tehran. The version quoted is the one which Averell Harriman wrote down. Harriman was the US ambassador to the Soviet Union at the time. He wrote, Churchill had just raised his glass for the concluding toast when Stalin requested the privilege of proposing one more toast to the President and the people of the United States. I want to tell you from the Russian point of view what the President of the United States have done to win the war. The most important things in this war are machines. The United States have proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only turn out at most 3,000 airplanes a month. England turns out 3,000 to 3,500, which are principally heavy bombers. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the use of those machines through Lend-lease, we would lose this war. This generous tribute prompted Roosevelt to ask for the last word. He talked about the diversity of political complexions around the banquet table, which he said reminded him of the rainbow to Americans, a symbol of good fortune and hope. The fact that Stalin said this is confirmed in the minutes of the meeting taken by FDR's son-in-law, John Bottger. As such, Stalin did indeed say this, or at least something close to this, before translation. Let's examine this a little more closely, though. Stalin said we would lose this war. In most uses of this quote, it is interpreted as meaning the Soviet Union would lose this war. But that is not what he actually said. He had just been speaking about the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, both Britain and the Soviet Union being recipients of Lend-lease. When he said we, he may have meant the alliance as a whole, or Britain and the Soviet Union. There's no grammatical reason to assume that he only meant the Soviet Union rather than the group that he had been discussing. Next, it is worth noting that the context of the quote is often left out. Harriman describes this statement as a generous tribute to Roosevelt. This occurred during an informal birthday dinner in which there had already been many jokes and toasts. Churchill had just made flattering remarks about Roosevelt and Stalin, going as far as saying that the British felt a bit more pink, a joke about becoming halfway red or communist, if you will. Clearly, people had been drinking a lot. People were joking and giving out compliments to be pleasant. Should we take compliments given over dinner as factual evaluations of Lend-lease? I think not. Stalin mentions only aircraft, but the general consensus is that this was not the most important category of Lend-lease. Nor did Stalin specifically say the USSR in particular would have lost. This toast is meant to make good relations with the large number of Americans present and show them appreciation. The context of this quote is practically never discussed when it is used, unfortunately. We can also look at how Stalin talks about such things in general, even specifically to Western leaders. For example, let's look at a telegram sent directly from Stalin to Churchill on the 3rd of September 1941. I think the only way is to open a second front this year somewhere in the Balkans or France, one that would divert 30 to 40 German divisions from the Eastern Front and simultaneously supply the Soviet Union with 30,000 tons of aluminium by the beginning of October and a minimum monthly aid of 400 aeroplanes and 500 tanks of small or medium size. Without these two kinds of aid, the Soviet Union will be either defeated or weakened to the extent that it will lose for a long time the ability to help its allies by active operations at the front against Hitlerism. I realize this message will cause Your Excellency some vexation, but that cannot be helped. Experience has taught me to face up to reality, no matter how unpleasant it may be, and not shrink from telling the truth, no matter how unpleasant it is. Here you have Stalin in 1941 again saying the USSR would lose without aid. They were asking for 30,000 tons of aluminium, 400 aircraft and 500 tanks per month. In 1941, the Soviets got 750 aircraft. That is only 62.5% of what Stalin requested. Meanwhile, they got 361 tanks, which is only 24% of what Stalin requested. Detailed statistics for aluminium deliveries are not available to say if they met the request, but it would be very unlikely, as the request was 10% of all aluminium the USSR received until 1945. Perhaps most striking is Stalin's request for a British-led invasion of Europe in 1941 that was powerful enough to distract at least 30 divisions. This, of course, did not happen. Churchill made excuses for the next 3 years on why Britain had to delay real combat operations on the ground. Despite Stalin saying they would lose without this, the USSR did not lose. Stalin's request was not met, and the USSR still did not lose. So why did Stalin say it? To me, the answer is obvious. Stalin wanted Britain and the USA to do more. He felt that they would only do something if they thought the USSR would be defeated without aid. That seems to be all there is to it. If we believe that the USSR would have lost simply because Stalin said so to the British or Americans, then the USSR should have lost in 1941, because the conditions for this defeat as described by Stalin actually happened, and yet they did not lose. The obvious conclusion here is that at least Stalin's evaluations were wrong. And in reality, and more likely, Stalin used this as a way of putting pressure on the Western allies to do more and nothing else. It was a diplomatic ploy, not an actual economic evaluation of Lend-lease. In summary, Khrushchev did not say that the USSR would have lost if we rely on the more complete memoir edition associated with his son rather than the Cold War American publication. Stalin did say the USSR would have lost on several occasions, in fact, and at least once with the condition that made it clear that he was simply exaggerating. The context of the Stalin quotes makes his political motives clear. He wished to encourage Western allies to provide more support. This context is often absent when such quotes are used in popular discussions, or even many papers, to argue about the decisive significance of Lend-lease. Understanding this context helps ensure these sources are used more accurately, but it should still be understood that even when you read all of the sources, you still do not know how much Lend-lease was delivered compared to how much material was produced in the Soviet Union. And ultimately, this is the only real measure of how important an economic item is, comparing what is available.